Gunfire is still echoing around the centre of Grozny, and there is no talk of peace or compromise in these streets.
These people were civilians trying to flee the fighting. All okay? Even in areas supposedly captured from the Chechens several days ago, they're still meeting resistance. Even as we waited for the bombardment to stop, the fighters dismissed suggestions of a ceasefire, saying Yeltsin was not to be trusted.
Inside the palace, more Russian prisoners, the frightened survivors of Saturday's failed offensive. But the signs are that their army is preparing for another push. Of Grozny, the presidential palace is ablaze. Set alight by Russian artillery, it is suffering the same fate as the Moscow White House just over a year ago. But here, the Chechens are not ready to give up. ITN has established that the Russians used cluster bombs. They are weapons designed to kill or maim combat troops. Now Boris Yeltsin's government is using them against civilians that it says are citizens of the Russian Federation.
There is intense anger here at the death of teenagers like Andrei, as there is at the reluctance of the military to tell families about the fate of their sons and brothers.
This morning, the people of Grozny learned once again what Boris Yeltsin means by a bombing halt.
The presidential palace, symbol of rebel resistance, has lost its upper floors but remains in Chechen hands tonight, though the Russians are gaining ground and appear to be trying to encircle Grozny, cutting any line of retreat.
The presidential palace was hit this morning by shellfire. While the Kremlin is denying that it suffered a tactical defeat at the hands of Chechen fighters, Russian forces are reining back from claims that they control Grozny. As civilians fled under sniper fire, the Chechens were consolidating their positions in the city. Despite renewed shelling and air raids, it does appear a clear fact that the defenders of Grozny have control at the moment. Latest estimates from a group of Russian lawmakers who left Grozny for Moscow yesterday put casualties into the hundreds over the past few days. The Chechen fighters are still adamant they can hold out. This war, despite its escalation, appears to have no effect on their fighting spirit. By complete contrast, the Russian army is now even lower on morale. Taking Grozny won't be an answer either militarily or politically. It would leave them with a long winter war. Another chapter to this conflict. And with that prospect, despite reinforcements sent in by their military masters in Moscow, officers on the ground are having increasing problems with dissent. They're faced with two grim prospects: street fighting in Grozny, and if that battle is won, the inevitable guerrilla war which will be waged from the mountains behind them. Andrew Simmons, ITN, on the Chechen border.
In the early hours of this morning, death came to the village of Meskar-Yurt, south of Grozny. Russian aircraft dropped a string of bombs into the center of the village, smashing houses and destroying lives. At least 10 people died in the nighttime carnage, which once again had no evident strategic purpose, except the spreading of terror. The people here do not understand why the heart of their quiet village has suddenly been ripped out by massive Russian bombs, nor do they understand why Western governments, including the British government, which have in the past said so much about human rights in Russia, are now keeping silent. These are the survivors of yesterday's bomb attack on a crossroads near the village of Shali, an attack which killed at least 28 people. ITN has established that the Russians used cluster bombs, bombs that contain scores of separate explosive charges, each encased in a sheath of ball bearings. The bombs set off a blizzard of flying metal. They are weapons designed to kill or maim combat troops. Now Boris Yeltsin's government is using them against civilians that it says are citizens of the Russian Federation. Boris Yeltsin has now apparently ordered a halt to the bombing of Grozny to prevent further civilian casualties. But since his similar promise last week resulted only in a blitz on the capital, few people here have much confidence in his words today. Julian Mannion, News at 10 on the outskirts of Grozny. Until the reported air attack on the presidential palace, the action had been on the ground. Chechen troops tried to flush out Russian snipers near the center of Grozny. A Russian tank shell slammed into Palace Square. Inside the palace, more Russian prisoners, the frightened survivors of Saturday's failed offensive. But the signs are that their army is preparing for another push. Gunfire is still echoing around the center of Grozny, and there is no talk of peace or compromise in these streets. Indeed, the Russian minister in charge of Chechen affairs, Nikolai Yegorov, whose statements range from the hawkish to the dangerously extreme, has promised that as soon as the weather clears, Russian troops will make another attempt to seize the Chechen capital. Near the fighting, one family that had had enough. Two sisters led a 5-year-old child away from the gunfire as teams of Chechen fighters moved towards it. The sisters, Anya and Ludmila, left their home in northern Grozny this morning and without a car or any of their belongings, simply set out to walk through the ravaged city to what they hope will be safety in the south. This morning, the people of Grozny learned once again what Boris Yeltsin means by a bombing halt. Artillery shells instead of aerial bombs rained down on the center of the city. The shells and missiles smashed into apartment blocks, starting fires which the helpless occupants were powerless to put out. Most of the devastation was in residential areas, making a further mockery of the Russian president's claim that he is trying to avoid civilian casualties. Though today there did appear to be some sort of military objective behind the carnage. Russian shells are coming in from their positions just over there and striking near the main road into the city center, just a few hundred yards behind us. And it seems that the Russian objective is to try and sever that part of the city which contains the presidential palace from the rest of the Chechen forces in the south. Under the shell fire, the Chechen fighters remained astonishingly calm. Even while the bombardment continued, fresh troops arrived in the city center, prepared to face a Russian ground attack if it came. Reserves waiting in a nearby cellar chanted songs as they prepared for action. Today, they once again struck a telling blow against the Russian army. South of Grozny, in broad daylight, they blew up a bridge which Russian armor was trying to cross. The Russian tanks and their crews plunged into the riverbed below. Part of Grozny, the presidential palace, is ablaze. Set alight by Russian artillery, it is suffering the same fate as the Moscow White House just over a year ago. But here, the Chechens are not ready to give up. News came through of another setback for the Russians. The commander of their Interior Ministry troops, General Viktor Vorbyov, has been killed by a Chechen mortar shell. This came as the Chechens tried to fight off another Russian ground assault near the city center. The Russians are now bombarding the city from 3 separate directions. And the sounds of machine gun fire between the explosions are apparently coming from some of their elite troops that they've now pushed into forward positions. The Chechens seem more somber than in recent days, but they remain grimly determined. On the Russian Christmas Day, Boris Yeltsin's government continued its work of demolishing a city that it claims as its own. Once again, the artillery fire struck houses and apartment buildings, where the civilians who are unable or unwilling to flee are trying to survive. How Moscow hopes to transform these people into loyal citizens by shelling them is a mystery, as is the question of how a bankrupt Russian nation can possibly pay for the damage that its army is now inflicting. A Russian army equipped to fight a Third World War is now trying to break Chechen resistance by sheer firepower. Their tanks are now only 200 yards from the presidential palace, but the Chechens are putting up fierce resistance. A stream of Chechen casualties is coming back from the front. Civilian volunteers, many with terrible wounds, others beyond all help. This group of Chechen fighters is about to go and reinforce their positions around the presidential palace, which is being attacked by at least 2 groups of Russian soldiers in a kind of pincer movement. The road they're going down is called Freedom Avenue, and it's under heavy fire. Tonight it seems that the Chechen defense lines have bent but not broken, and Moscow has admitted that Chechen resistance is bitter. Perhaps in frustration, the Russian Air Force has again broken Boris Yeltsin's public promise not to bomb Grozny. Chechen civilians were killed and injured when Russian planes fired rockets into a residential area. What the renewed airstrikes show is either that Boris Yeltsin is no longer concerned to make his public statements truthful, or that he is no longer in full control of his armed forces.
On a muddy hillside in western Chechnya, troops from Russia's Interior Ministry scramble at the sight of an approaching armoured personnel carrier. They don't know if it's one of theirs or one of the Chechens. As it passes, they open fire, wildly, still none the wiser who they're firing at. Minutes later, a white car is spotted on a road below them. With little thought, they again open fire. This is how we met these troops, when our car came under fire without warning. These soldiers are nervous and ill-disciplined. One officer, who told us only that his name was Yuri, said they're only responding to attacks on them, launched from local villages.
During the
night, the local population comes out. They have an arms dump somewhere here. During the night, they mine the roads. And in the morning, our armor gets blown up.
The base is near the village of Zarkan-Yuat, some 20 miles west of Grozny. Their role is supposedly to disarm fighters who may have fled 2 villages outside the capital. But few of these men want to be here. They don't understand what they're supposed to be doing. All they know for sure is that the local people don't want them. The deputy commander of 2,000 Interior Ministry troops in the region is Andrei Skripnikov.
We, as the Interior Ministry troops, are conducting battles of so-called local significance here. But we are losing people for the sake of nothing.
Few of their families know they are stationed in Chechnya, nor that they are already fighting what is becoming the second, more deadly phase of the Chechen War. There's been much talk about if there will be a guerrilla war once Grozny has been taken. This provides ample evidence that such a war is already beginning. Since our car had been crippled by gunfire, we left the area courtesy of an army truck, passing columns of fresh tanks plus all manner of support vehicles. Grozny is still the target, though another war is already underway in the countryside and hills around them, fueled by what appears to be arbitrary brutality of the Russian troops. Ian Williams, News at 10, Chechnya.
Heavy fighting is now going on around the Dynamo football stadium over there, which is about half a mile away from the presidential palace. The football stadium is one of the main staging points for the Russian forces inside the city. And the fact that so much fighting is happening there indicates that in that district at least, the Chechen lines are holding. The Chechens still hold one important card, a large number of Russian prisoners. In a village south of Grozny, they paraded 39 members of the supposedly elite Russian parachute brigade. These men were sent on a reconnaissance mission, but surrendered when they were cut off. For a moment, Russian and Chechen can smile together, but in Grozny, there is only savagery, bloodshed, and tears. Julian Mannion, ITN, Grozny. Early this morning, the guns were silent, and it was possible for the defenders of the presidential palace to view the devastation that surrounds them. Much of the area is now paved with rubble and littered with smashed vehicles. It is a landscape from World War II, but here today, the wreckage is still burning. In the residential area nearby, the devastation is shocking. Great apartment buildings smashed and gutted by fire, whole trees uprooted by the shells, and incredibly, civilian survivors trying to tidy up their private corner of hell. Then, as we filmed, Russian shells began to fall again and firing broke out. Fighting has now broken out again in the central area, just over that bridge behind me over there. And the problem is that there is now so much bitterness and savagery in this conflict that it may be impossible for any ceasefire to really hold at all. At the presidential palace, Russia's truce brought more Russian gunfire. Chechens fired at Russian snipers. But the fighting was far less intense than in recent days, and in the quiet periods, the Chechens took advantage of the lull to push more troops forward and to bring out their wounded. These men, dazed by shell shock, their clothing stained with blood, still swore to fight on. For one woman, the first day of partial truce brought tears and later at least some joy. Tamsila Mukhmadiev is one of the Russian mothers trying to rescue her soldier son, who is a prisoner of the Chechens. Today in the presidential palace, the Chechens permitted her to embrace him, but said that his release, like that of the other prisoners, would depend on General Dudayev's decision. And still unscathed, a Chechen boy volunteer. Rustan Satayev is 13 years old and attached to one of the small Chechen platoons that have been battling the Russian army. He claims that he has killed Russian soldiers and says he volunteered because the Chechens' numbers are so few. But for many people remaining in Grozny, the desire is for survival, the prayer that the truce announcement is a move towards peace. For them, even the reduction in gunfire is a sign of hope. Julian Mannion, News at 10, Grozny.
Certainly it was quieter in Grozny today. But although the fighting had slackened, there were still regular bursts of sniper fire, together with some mortar and artillery rounds, especially in the area around the presidential building. Several civilians, seeing the lull in fighting as a chance to leave their homes in search of food, were reportedly killed. The International Committee of the Red Cross saw it as an opportunity to take their first lorry load of medical and other supplies into Grozny since mid-December. But they abandoned the idea because of the continued fighting. Instead, the supplies were delivered to an outlying village. The man who thought he had organized a lasting truce returned from Grozny to Nazran in neighboring Ingushetia, angry and disappointed. Sergei Kovalyov, the Russian Human Rights Commissioner, has been a lonely figure, still trying to mediate between the Chechens and Moscow. His tireless efforts have won admiration at home and abroad, and he represents perhaps the last hope of a negotiated settlement. He told us he thought he'd done a deal with the Russian Prime Minister, Viktor Chernomyrdin, but says it was sabotaged by the Russian military.
Вдруг появляется ультимативное заявление правительства.
Suddenly there appeared an ultimatum from the Russian government, written in most insulting form. I regard it as a step to prevent the ceasefire. Those generals with big bellies don't give a damn whose children are lying dead in the streets. Their corpses being eaten by the dogs. They really don't give a damn.
Наплевать им на эти трупы. К чему могут стремиться?
There is only one thing those scoundrels are thinking about in their bunker in Mozdok.
Это любыми силами.
How to raise their flag over the ruins of the presidential building.
Tell me about your own conversations with Viktor Chernomyrdin. What was your understanding? What was the arrangement you thought you'd come to?
Я обращаюсь к Черномырдину.
When I spoke to Chernomyrdin, I set these specific goals, helping the injured and clearing the dead bodies. And we agreed upon this.
Именно на этом мы пришли к соглашению.
In Nazran, refugees from Grozny are reunited. They'd lost touch with each other in the scramble to leave. Refugees have flooded this city, and the central market has become a favoured spot for reunions and for exchanging news from Chechnya. Today, the prospect of a ceasefire dominated conversation. Among those here, Rodima, a Grozny University professor who's working the market to help raise money for the family she's staying with. One of her friends slipped back to Grozny yesterday during the lull in fighting.
There are many houses broken near the place where we lived, and I'm very glad that my house is not broken and nobody is killed.
Sergei Kovalov is still in Nazran this evening, but is planning to return to Grozny. He's been trying once again to contact the Russian Prime Minister, Viktor Chernomyrdin. The chances of a peaceful settlement here do now look extremely slim, but the Russian Human Rights Commissioner says he has not yet given up hope. Ian Williams, Channel 4 News, Nazran.
Today, Russian state television said that Russian forces were still observing the terms of the truce, but the Chechen parliament was burning after another direct hit. Shells screamed into the city centre at a rate of up to 10 a minute. This followed a random bombardment of residential areas last night. It is not clear what the Russians hope to gain by their relentless shelling of civilian areas, but what is certain is that it is destroying countless lives. And in a cellar, Vladimir Lyshenko, a 70-year-old paralyzed Russian war veteran. He is now trying to survive Russian shells. For these people, there is only one question: when will their nightmare end? Julian Mannion, ITN, Grozny.
Two Ingush brothers return to their village on a hilltop close to the border with Chechnya. They bring news of yet another Russian military column, which is soon moving along the valley road below. In the build-up to the latest assault on Grozny, the toing and froing of armour and supplies has been a common sight for the people of Gazayurt. Instinctively they move out of sight. Except Medina, that is. She angrily makes her way into the garden and curses at the helicopters overhead. Last month, her son was shot dead by passing Russian soldiers who thought there were snipers in the village. Other houses have been targeted by passing Russian tanks, their gunners anxious and nervous about the village above them. Here they claim there's no reason to be targeted in such a way. The village elders have so far calmed the younger members of the community, but they say the behavior of the Russian soldiers is driving these Ingush people closer to their Chechen neighbors.
The Chechens and the Ingush are brothers. We will live and die together.
Several Ingush villages, most on Russian supply routes close to the Chechen border, have been shelled by the Russian army, even though they're some 35 miles from Grozny. As a result, the president of Ingushetia, himself an Afghan war veteran, has protested to Moscow. He says the actions of the Russian army threaten to sweep the Ingush people into the conflict.
You can't separate the Chechen problem from that of Ingushetia and the rest of the Caucasus. We're all being dragged into it. I, as a president, will hardly be able to stop people who live by the laws of the mountains, the laws of vendetta, and want to show solidarity with the Chechen people.
Nazran, the Ingush capital, is already overflowing with refugees, their numbers boosted by the intense shelling of the last 2 days. Many are staying in railway wagons at the city's station. Most are with family or friends, a remarkable display of solidarity. Arriving with the refugees today, 3 Russian members of parliament. They'd been living in the south of the Chechen capital for a month and arrived in Nazran saying that only protests from the west could now stop the carnage.
The democratic West must intervene because the democratic forces in Russia are now confronting a powerful, well-established military machine which is out of control.
машина, которая вышла из повиновения.
Обезумевшая волчица съедает своего волка.
To see a mad wolf eating its young is a terrifying sight. But this madness is precisely what is happening to Russia.
Безумие надвинулось на Россию.
So far, the Ingush have expressed solidarity with their Muslim neighbour, largely by humanitarian and political means. They've shown considerable restraint. Russia, though, is pushing these proud mountain people to the limit. There seems little doubt that if the conflict in Chechnya does spread, Ingushetia will be the first to ignite. With Russia pressing ahead with its assault on Grozny tonight, the atmosphere here is more tense than ever. Ian Williams, Channel 4 News, Nazran.
The Russian Air Force has used one of the most horrific weapons in its arsenal on a roundabout in the heart of Grozny. 100 yards away, a BBC television crew dived for cover as a cluster bomb went off. The explosions of the multiple bomblets, which contained ball bearings, echoed for 15 seconds. The effect on survivors was blind panic. At the roundabout, at least 3 people died in a blizzard of flying metal. In the area around the presidential palace, which is almost invisible in the smoke, a desperate battle is now taking place. The Chechens are being attacked by elite units of Russian Marines, and there is fighting from building to building, sometimes from room to room. But the Chechens are still holding out. For the casualties, it's a jolting ride down avenues full of whistling bullets, and if they're lucky, a bus ride to safety. These injured people, both soldiers and civilians, are being driven out of the city because the only hospitals still working in the area simply can't treat them properly. They're going to be driven across the Chechen border to another hospital, which, even though it's desperately short of supplies, may be able to do something about their wounds. For these people, there's hope. For many more left behind, only terror and despair.
Only from long distance or from the safety of cellars is it possible to witness the destruction of Grozny. Under this bombardment, even the Chechen fighters leave shelter only to recover their dead and wounded. In a brutal attempt to pound the Chechens into submission, the Russian army has again shelled civilian areas. For some reason, the village of Bilgatoy, 6 miles from Grozny, was their latest target. The presidential palace, symbol of rebel resistance, has lost its upper floors but remains in Chechen hands tonight, though the Russians are gaining ground and appear to be trying to encircle Grozny, cutting any line of retreat. Military commanders back in Moscow say the end is now in sight for their Chechen campaign. The fall of Grozny seems inevitable and probably imminent. But on 3 separate fronts, the formidable Russian army is still being held up and often humiliated by the Chechen fighters. Paul Davis, ITN, on the Chechen border.
The bodies are brought back secretly to Moscow, delivered in crates in the early hours, and before dawn handed unceremoniously back to their families. Russia is not proud of its Chechen war dead. Andrei Akhmadulin was 18 years old and a conscript. He'd been in the army just 6 months when his unit was ordered into Grozny on New Year's Eve. His mother knows, as every Russian knows, these teenagers should never have been sent to war.
They've sent me what was left of him. He was a young kid with no training. He hardly knew how to use a gun. Our children are being sent into a slaughterhouse.
There is intense anger here at the death of teenagers like Andrei, as there is at the reluctance of the military to tell families about the fate of their sons and brothers.
However much the Russian authorities try to hide the facts, they cannot hide from scenes like this. And once again, just as during the Afghan war, it is the mothers of soldiers who are leading the opposition.
Mothers who can tolerate seeing sons drafted into the army straight from school, but who can't tolerate them being sent to war. In Moscow, mothers are encouraging their sons to desert, writing letters to the authorities protesting their boys are untrained to fight. These 2 women helped their sons desert their unit last week, just as it had been ordered to Chechnya. And soon after speaking to us, they took them into hiding. Both are still teenagers, Both spoke of their total unreadiness to fight.
I'm not trained as a soldier. I've only been to the rifle range twice, and we were only given 12 rounds each. And it's the same in other units.
We spent most of our time doing chores. Of course, if Russia was attacked, we would fight. But to attack other Russians? No.
Before this war is over, these thousands of wooden boxes will have been filled. James Mates, News at 10, Moscow.
For almost an hour today, we were pinned down with a group of Chechen fighters as shells fell around the Minutska Square area of the city. Even as we waited for the bombardment to stop, the fighters dismissed suggestions of a ceasefire, saying Yeltsin was not to be trusted. In the cellars and wrecked houses, survival is the priority. After all, the same Russians promised they wouldn't bomb Grozny. In a new move, the Russian army has blown up a key bridge on the road leading south from Grozny to neighbouring Dagestan. It was the Chechens' main supply route and a road to safety should the city fall. Once again, we've seen the two faces of Russian policy. While their prime minister was offering a truce, the military were blowing up the Chechens' main line of retreat out of their capital.
From ITN, News at 10 with Trevor McDonald.
The symbol of Chechen resistance finally falls to Russia. Good evening. The Russians have taken the presidential palace in Grozny, the capital of Chechnya. For weeks, the Chechens had defended it with grim determination. Shelled and battered though it was, it stood for their independence. Today, they were forced to cut their losses and to withdraw. President Yeltsin said the capture of the palace meant that the military stage of his campaign against Chechen independence was effectively over. The Chechens insist it is not and say they'll fight on. ITN's Paul Davis reports from Grozny on the continuing bloodshed and shelling and his own narrow escape from it today.
In his underground bunker, the chief of Chechen military police said it was not surrender, but a strategic decision to withdraw from the palace. It's small consolation under such a bombardment, but many of the Russian weapons, like this missile, have proved defective and have failed to detonate. Small consolation indeed. All day, the Russians have been bringing up reinforcements to capitalize on their breakthrough. These are Spetsnaz, special forces trained for street fighting. This is a civilian area on the outskirts of the city. These people were civilians trying to flee the fighting. The blast from another shell blew two of us off the road. Shrapnel hit our vehicle, but we were unharmed. The Chechens said at least 7 people on the road had not been so fortunate. Paul Davis, ITN, Grozny. Even in areas supposedly captured from the Chechens several days ago, they're still meeting resistance. This Russian camp northeast of Grozny came under fire from unseen gunmen. The young conscripts appeared uncertain where the attack was coming from, returning fire in several directions. It's now 2 days since Boris Yeltsin said his Chechen campaign was virtually over, but still the fighters battle on despite the continued destruction of their capital. Paul Davis, ITN, Grozny. 3,000 feet up in the Caucasian mountains, the town of Vedeno could become a second capital if Grozny falls. There are fighters here watching for Russian helicopters and bombers, and many of the town's men have already experienced war. Like Shaman Adudayev, who's just returned from fighting the Russians in Grozny. The fight will switch to the mountains, he said. They can take our towns, but this will become a guerrilla war, a people's war, and the people will win. If the Chechens sound boastful, there is, of course, that other recent example of the mighty Red Army being humiliated by a fierce mountain people. It happened in Afghanistan, and it can happen here, they say, predicting the fall of Boris Yeltsin before the fall of Chechnya.
It's been a difficult month at the Nazran oil depot. As the fighting has continued in neighboring Chechnya, so supplies here have become erratic. Fuel for the region having to be brought in from central Russia. Until a few days before Russian troops entered Chechnya, this depot was still buying Chechen fuel, as were other Russian republics across the northern Caucasus. For 3 years, Moscow claimed to be operating an economic blockade against the rebel Chechen government of Dzhokhar Dudayev. Yet oil kept flowing down pipelines and on trains out of Grozny. Sultan, who's worked in the industry here for 21 years, says until December he could get most oil products from Grozny at 24 hours notice.
Dudayev made no difference to us. Supplies continued as normal.
The region has also seen something of a building boom. Palatial houses are being erected outside town and along the road to the Chechen border. Outside the biggest private building company in Nazran, the Chechen, Ingush and Russian flags side by side. The director says business has never been better, catering until the war for rich Caucasian traders who thrived under Dzhokhar Dudayev.
The whole economic blockade was a joke. The airport remained open and all the vital Chechen industries were working.
Grozny was the most important oil center in southern Russia. Its refining complex dominated the western approaches to the city. Pipelines carried oil from Siberia and the Caspian Sea. After Dudayev came to power, the industry did decline, but it continued to work and to export, something it could only have done with Russian approval. For 2 years, from 1991, Salman Khasiminov, 6 times world wrestling champion for the Soviet Union, headed the Chechen National Security Service, Dudayev's KGB. He says oil dominated Chechen politics. Political conflicts revolved around access to petrodollars, and the whole business was only possible because of secret and corrupt agreements with Moscow officials.
Russia could have blocked any pipeline at any time. Instead, the Russian government provided licenses for sale of the oil. And at that time, without a license from the government licensing department, it was impossible to sell a gram of oil. Although there were no formal agreements between Chechnya and Russia, the business went on as usual. The question here is how the financial accounts were settled between Russia and Dudayev's regime.
Khasiminov says the proceeds from oil sales were split 50-50 with government officials in Moscow. He can't name those officials, but says the Chechen share was paid into secret bank accounts.
Our state budget was totally closed to the people and much of the government. Dudayev himself described it as a state secret.
Right up to the eve of the war, lorries laden with Chechen goods traversed the Caucasus, unhindered by any Russian control. There can be no doubt that a lot of people here in the Caucasus and in Moscow became very rich thanks to the rebel regime of Dzhokhar Dudayev. And the authorities in Moscow did very little to stop that happening, until, that is, last summer. That's when Russia adopted a new, more aggressive policy towards Chechnya. And that policy coincided with another development, a massive economic development to the south of here, based on the oil fields of the Caspian Sea. Baku, the capital of the former Soviet Republic of Azerbaijan, used to be one of the biggest oil producers in the world. Last September, the Azeri government signed a £5 billion deal with a consortium of Western companies, including BP, to develop oil fields in the Caspian Sea. It's one of the biggest projects in the former Soviet Union. But a bitter dispute erupted over how the oil will be transported once it's out of the ground. Russia wants control and lucrative transit fees and insists her pipelines be used, pipelines that pass through Grozny. Significantly, the man named by Russia to head an interim government in Grozny once the war is over is Stalemate Hajiev, a Chechen who used to be Soviet oil minister. That will come as little comfort to the Russian soldiers now fighting and dying in Grozny, trying to depose a regime that was allowed to thrive thanks to corrupt officials in Moscow. Ian Williams, Channel 4 News in the northern Caucasus. Beside the frozen Volga River, the city of Samara. At this time of year, there's little to distinguish it from a string of industrial cities along the river. All have a memorial to those who died in the last war. Yet it's another conflict, the Chechen War, that has stung this city and region like nowhere else in Russia. 1 month ago today, on New Year's Eve, it was young conscripts from Samara who led the disastrous first assault on Grozny. A month on, the memory of that still haunts the young soldiers who survived, most of them 18 and 19-year-old conscripts. They're among nearly 300 being treated at Samara's military hospital. These men are from Samara's 1,000-strong 81st Motor Rifle Regiment. Though the army won't release casualty figures for the regiment, half those who led the assault are thought to have been killed, injured, or are still missing. Andrei was shot in the leg as they retreated from Grozny's railway station.
All streets were blocked, and they were shooting from every building. There were lots of grenades. They had us surrounded. There was no way out. Of course, if we'd been supported by aircraft and artillery, our losses would have been far less. Far less.
Since that terrifying night, the injured from the 81st have been joined in this hospital by a stream of casualties from other regiments. These soldiers are the lucky ones. Many others are still missing. Officially, the army says 100 from the region can't be accounted for. Others believe this is a wild underestimate. The hospital has been besieged by anxious parents. Many mothers turn up daily to try and find news of their sons. And the hospital's been receiving 1,000 telephone calls every day.
There are relatives who simply come here looking for their sons. They ask the wounded soldiers whether they have seen them or not. Some find their sons in this hospital, recovering from wounds. Those mothers are happy. The others, who don't find their sons here, they cry.
Svetlana's 19-year-old son Oleg is missing. He was in the 81st. Oleg was married days before being sent to Chechnya in December. The last time his mother heard from him was a letter written in the middle of that month. She's had little help from the army and was even threatened with the police when she tried directly approaching one general from her son's unit.
Unreasonable, senseless politicians. They just do everything for themselves. They do nothing for our boys. I just want my son back. That's the only one thing I want. I pray to God for him to return. I want my son back. I want my son back.
In response to pressure from the local committee of soldiers' mothers, the army has opened an information office in Samara. There's already been thousands of inquiries from relatives and friends of those serving in Chechnya. So far, 50 families have been notified of their son's death. Privately, many officers and doctors say the flow of information is chaotic. Many soldiers listed as alive and well may be dead or missing, and the information isn't trusted by parents. The overwhelming mood here in Samara is one of anger. Anger at the politicians and generals who they believe used young conscripts as cannon fodder in their ill-planned assault on Grozny. From here, too, statements in Moscow about the war are seen as absurd, perverse even. And in a display bordering on the surreal, the Defense Ministry paraded several soldiers in front of the press in Moscow to show how well equipped and well provided for is the army in Chechnya. One man who knows the reality, though, is Colonel General Edward Vorobyov. He resigned in December, refusing to take charge of the Chechen operation, having seen how ill-prepared were regiments like the 81st in Samara.
It was not cowardice. I was responsible for badly prepared soldiers and civilians who would have died on my orders.
The longer-term implications of the Chechen War are already being considered by General Alexander Lebed, the commander of Russia's 14th Army, Pavel Grachov's strongest critic, and the most popular general among officers in the armed forces.
Someone will have to be held responsible for thousands of corpses. Pavel Grachov has every chance of being in that highly unenviable position.
He says the only positive thing to come out of the war will be to speed up reform in the army.
There hasn't been a war for a long time, and today's politicians haven't the remotest understanding of war. That's why so many bad decisions were taken with such ease.
That will come as little comfort to the anxious parents of Samara. Even for the lucky ones who've been reunited with their sons, the Chechen War has dealt a severe blow to their confidence in the army and in the government of Boris Yeltsin. Ian Williams, Channel 4 News, Samara.